getting it back. And then finally, Max, one quick headline here before you turn to the second half. Israelis turn out for largest economic protest. So remember, Max, I talked about the breakaway wealth. This is the same situation that is happening in Israel, because even though Israel emerged from the global financial crisis relatively unscathed, the economy is enjoying rapid growth and unemployment is at its lowest in decades at around 5.5%. So it all looks good on the surface, right? Regardless, statistics show the ranks of the working poor have grown dramatically as wealth has increasingly become concentrated among a small group of tycoons.
Well, you got to go now change the nomenclature from the Arab Spring to the Arab-Israeli Spring.
Well, yes, actually a lot of the protesters are claiming alliance with the Tahrir Square.
Of course.
And also, this final image here, Max, this is Crash JP Morgan buy silver in Hebrew.
Shalom. All right, Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Germany and speak with economist Shir Heaver. Shir, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hi, Max. Always good to speak to you.
All right, Shir, Israel has been hit with protests over the summer, with 400,000 protesting last weekend. Why is 5% of the population of Israel protesting? What are the demands?
Well, we have to ask ourselves, why didn't it happen before? Because actually Israel is undergoing a deep social crisis for the past few decades, with very rapidly growing inequality, uncared for poverty and uncared for unemployment, which have been expanding and affecting every aspect of life in Israel. And yet most people didn't really protest until very recently. And this wave of protest is something very new in Israel, quite unprecedented. There's never been such a large demonstration in Israel's history. And people have a lot of reasons to protest.
Okay, now is it possible that the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings in Egypt, Tunis, and around the Arab world gave cover to these protests in Israel? And if so, doesn't this speak toward a greater Mid-East society getting rid of all of these divisions that have been plaguing the region for decades?
The first reaction in Israeli society to the Arab Spring was panic, actually, because the idea that Arab countries could be democratic and the people can set their own destiny was something that intimidated a lot of Israelis who were counting on U.S. support in crushing the Arab peoples and making sure that they operate within the framework of U.S. interests, which also works very well for the Israeli Middle East strategy. But I think with the global excitement about the Arab Spring, especially the revolution in Egypt, a lot of Israelis said, well, we also want to get some of that international excitement. We also want the world to be excited about what we're doing. I think one of the reasons for this is that there is now an international boycott campaign against Israel, against the apartheid that Israeli society applies against Palestinians in Israel. And Israelis feel very isolated. They're feeling that they're pariahs in today's world because of this boycott campaign. And so by emulating the Arab Spring, they're hoping maybe to get some international support.
Okay, now you mentioned, of course, the relationship with the U.S. and the enormous support the U.S. gives Israel every year for decades. And the commentators in the American press who are covering this at all, the uprising in Israel, they're finding it difficult to talk about the demands of the protesters, because the demands of the protesters are for things like greater distribution of wealth and greater equality in income distribution. And these, of course, are ideas that America equates with socialism and communism. So there's an enormous disconnect here, because America aids Israel billions of dollars every single year, and yet the people of Israel don't seem to want to emulate what's happening in America at all.
I would say the majority of the protesters are talking about raising taxes. They want higher taxes so that there will be a sufficient income to implement social programs and policies that they're asking for, which is the complete opposite of the main discourse in the U.S. that taxes are considered the root of all evil and any call for raising taxes is immediately equated with communism. I completely agree with that. But we have to remember that this is rooted in Israeli history, because Israel used to be, unlike the U.S., a corporative society which had a very strong welfare state and a very strong system of unions that worked for Jewish citizens, only Jewish citizens, for the elite of society, with collaboration with the government and with the major employers, to create a kind of society where there were very strong social policies, but only for Jews, mainly for Jews who originate from European countries. And this is a memory that appeals to a lot of young Israelis who, in today's neoliberal economy, find that they can no longer count on the government to help them in finding an apartment. They can no longer be sure that their wages will be enough to sustain their standard of living. They get very worried, and now they're saying, let's go back to what we had with the welfare state 30 years ago, 40 years ago and more.
All right, so the people of Israel are for peace and justice. They're out there, a huge percentage of the population, 5% of the population is in the square, in the streets, protesting for peace and justice. However, the government of Israel, of course, is attracting huge aid from America by playing the violence card, by playing the terrorism card, by committing acts of terror in Palestine and around the region. Now, let me ask you a question then. When you see a U.S. politician like Sarah Palin wearing a Star of David, she's not identifying with the people of Israel, isn't she? She's identifying with the government of Israel, who is basically, what she's saying is she's for senseless slaughter of innocents, and therefore she should be president. Isn't that kind of what's going on there? Isn't that the message?
Let's make it very clear. The United States does not give aid to the Israeli society at all. The U.S. gives $3 billion every year to the Israeli government, but the money comes in the form of vouchers by which the Israeli government can only buy American-made weapons. So let's be very blunt about this. This is a subsidy to the U.S. arms industry. That's what this money is for. So when Obama or Palin or any other U.S. politician are talking about sustaining the friendship with Israel and the long-standing alliance between the U.S. and Israel, what they're actually saying, the U.S. will continue to subsidize the arms industry and make sure that the Middle East will continue to be very volatile, very violent, so that Israel will continue to buy weapons, so that the neighbors of Israel will continue to buy more weapons, and that will create huge profits for the U.S. arms manufacturers. Does that make the life of Israeli citizens any better? Certainly not. But it does make the life of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu better, because he knows that the one weapon he still has by which he can silence the protest, or at least he's hoping to silence the protest with, is war. If there's going to be another war in the Middle East, if there's going to be a violent clash with the Palestinians or with Lebanon, then or with Iran, then in the name of a state of emergency, he can recruit the young people, and they'll no longer be in the streets and the plazas demonstrating. Instead, they will be in uniform fighting a war, and that will be the end of the protest.
I asked my Twitter account, Max Keiser at Twitter, to ask you some questions, and one of those questions referred to war, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But before I do, let me continue on these protests. So you're saying that the needs of the warfare state, and Israel is primarily a warfare state, cannot go along pari passu with the welfare state. So the protesters how are they going to square that circle? Is there any way to transform the Israeli economy, which is currently now almost entirely contingent upon war? How are they going to transform the Israeli economy? What can they do to make Israel something less of a pariah and more of a functioning economy that's interested in the betterment of itself and those around it?
The Israeli economy is not really contingent or mainly upon war. The military part of the economy is about 12%. That's a lot. That's more than any other country in the world, probably. But it leaves 88%, which is not military related. And these 88% are most of the people. That's where where you find the doctors, the teachers, the social workers, people who are barely making ends meet. Without addressing the deep roots of injustice in Israeli Palestinian society, in the fact that there are millions of Palestinian refugees who have every right to return to Palestine, but they're not allowed to without addressing the issue of the fact that Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, so that Palestinians cannot be equal citizens in Israel. Without these issues, and of course the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where about a third of the population are not citizens, they're subjects without any rights. Without addressing these three issues, there's not going to be a real change in the way that the Israeli society works. But we were talking before about violence, and should the demonstrators use violence? I would say very clearly, the protesters should not turn violent. They don't need guillotines to change Israeli society. They need to do exactly the opposite. They need to refuse to take up arms. And any Israeli, young Israeli who refuses to become a soldier for yet another imperialist war in the Middle East, yet another kind of distraction by the Israeli government to distract from the social issues, they're going to bring the real change. They're going to allow the most important issues to come to the fore. The issues of justice.
Well said. So do you believe the tipping point of a mass movement toward refusing to serve in the Israeli Defense Initiative is upon us?
For the first time, there is a clear understanding of most of the protesters that it's likely that the government is going to try to use war to silence the demonstrations, and that the security excuse is really nothing more than an excuse. And that's something very new. That has never been the case before.
Fred Maestro, what role has the increase in food prices played in regards to the recent mass protests? Any chance that it could lead to more food-related riots?
The food prices were the trigger for the riots. The first thing that protesters organized, the first kind of protest, was the protest over cottage cheese prices. And they did this by use of Facebook and Twitter, and they organized a massive consumer boycott within Israel. And they were excited by the success of this campaign, and I think that was one of the reasons that they felt more confident to move into other issues, because the cottage cheese is important, but it's not the most important thing. There are things that people need much more acutely than the cheese. But yeah, food prices in Israel are actually very expensive, more expensive than they are in countries where the income per capita is double. And the reason for that, of course, is the massive burden of security, the cost of the army, the cost of the occupation.
All right, second question comes from Random UK Human on Twitter. He asks, what is the probability of Israel attacking or blowing up Iran? This is the big question.
Yeah, this is a very big question, and I'm not a prophet. I wouldn't be able to answer this, but there is a real risk, and unfortunately, the world community is not doing enough to try to prevent this kind of war, which could be catastrophic. Iran is doing at the moment nothing to provoke Israel into attacking, but Germany, for example, actually is selling Israel submarines that could be used to launch such an attack. I think one of the beacons of hope, at least for me, is the worsening relations between Israel and Turkey mean that it's much more difficult for Israel to send its planes over to bomb Iran without cooperation with Turkey. So maybe there is also a silver lining to that story.
Okay, Shir Hever, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Shir Hever. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.